Welcome back. As most of you know, I've been practicing and learning endgames, and one of the endgame positions that I need to work on and need to learn is the Lucena position. That's the position shown on the board here. Although it can vary a little bit, there are a few definitions that make this the Lucena position. And I'm going to try to go through all that and try to figure out what the steps are. This is not a teaching video. I don't yet know this, but if you want to follow along and learn it with me, or if you already know this and you want to find something that I've missed or that you can explain to me, feel free. Let's get to it. From what I understand, the definition of the Lucena position is a position in which both sides have a rook, both sides obviously have a king, and one side has a pawn. Now, that part is the same as the Philidor position, which I covered in a previous video, and I think I've learned that. The difference is, in the Philidor position, the side without the pawn can force a draw, but in the Lucena position, the side with the pawn can force the win. And one difference here in the Lucena position is that the king has to be in front of its pawn. The pawn is very close to promoting here. In order to promote, we have to get the king out of there to move this pawn forward. The problem is the opponent is going to try to keep us from doing that. One definition also is that the attacking side's rook has to be cutting off the enemy king from the promotion square. Obviously, our king right now guards these two squares, but we don't want that king to be able to get any closer like this. So that's the way I understand the definition. In the Lucena position, this pawn was further back, I think on the 5th rank, and the king was not in front of it. In fact, the enemy king was in front of it in the Philidor position. But in this, the Lucena position, the attacking side's king is in front of the pawn. So I'm going to go over to the Lucena position page on chess.com, which is a pretty decent explanation, in my opinion. I read through it briefly last night in order to familiarize myself. First, it says what the Lucena position is, and the fact that it was named after a person back in the 1600s who didn't actually include this in his book, but there was some confusion in the following decades, and so it was named after that person. But why is it important? Because rook endgames are the most common type of endings. The Lucena position is one of these endgames that is always winning for the side with the extra pawn. And if the player knows how to proceed, there's no way to stop them from winning. I'm not going to read the entire page. They went through a lot of work on this. So if you want to go there, feel free. If you use a search engine, it's one of the top results when you search for Lucena position. That's how I found it. And I wish it was a little easier to navigate to these pages within the site, but most of us, I think, have come to the point where we just search for the pages, even if we already are on the site that we want to see the page on, just because navigation can be complicated. And I don't know which of the left column menus to select to find this, or even if that would work. But the problem with white's position is that the king is in front of the pawn. Just ignore that GIF for a second. We're looking at this right here. The problem is that the white king is in front of the pawn, and this position is slightly different than the one we saw in the Lichess board editor over here, but the rules are still the same. The king is in front of the pawn. Our rook is cutting off the enemy king from getting there, and we're going to have trouble getting our king out and promoting that pawn. So it says black, on the other hand, wants to prevent that sequence. They plan to keep checking the white king as soon as it gets out of the pawn's way. Well, so that makes sense. If we switch back to the Lichess board editor, obviously if we move our king out of the way, they're going to check us over here. And if they check us, we can't promote our pawn on that turn. We have to move our king. And if we move our king further away and they check us again, and then we try to come toward the rook, they're going to check us again. And then if they ever get where they can line the rook up with that pawn, and we don't have a piece close enough to defend the pawn, then they can win it. And at some point, if we ever move this rook, they're going to be able to get their king over there. So that's the situation. And this site has a bunch of plans here and possibilities. And it says white's goal is to create a barrier between the black rook and the white pawn. This barrier would allow white to crown the pawn and win the game with their extra queen. And then it goes on to show us how to do that. Now, for those of you who have studied this and already know it, I understand that that is called a bridge in old parlance. And if we switch over to the Wikipedia page, it indeed calls it a bridge somewhere along here. And after defining it, of course, yeah, the bridge on the 5th rank. And I had somebody comment on my YouTube stream not too long ago saying the key to the Lucena position is learning how to build a bridge. And when I looked that up, it's referring to the same thing that chess.com calls a barrier. Bridge, I don't know where the term came from, or it might have originated in another language and then been translated into English. But my understanding of the word bridge, not related to chess, is that it's connecting one thing to another, like connecting one side of a river to the other side of the river so you can drive your car or your horse across the bridge. And we use it metaphorically speaking when we're talking about two people, like let's bridge the division between us, and in other words, to bring us together. Whereas this is a barrier. So I think chess.com's word works better for me. That white's goal is to create a barrier between the black rook and the white pawn. But whether you call it a bridge or a barrier, I think we're talking about the same thing. So I'm going to call it a barrier, but I might accidentally call it a bridge because that's what some people have told me it's called. Okay. Or here it calls it a shield, knowing that the goal is to create a shield for white's pawn to promote. And it comes up with a bunch of strategies for doing that. So, for example, it says the correct way is to move the rook to the 4th rank, or the 5th if you reach this position with the black pieces. Okay, so let's switch back over here to this board editor. But it says black to play, so I don't know where black would play here. So I'm going to click on the analysis board. So now that we have this on the analysis board, and if I turn on Stockfish over here at the side, and we will shrink the title down a little bit so you can see the suggestions here. It says that since it's black's move, black would play rook to g2. White has forced mate in 22 if black plays here. If black goes to d2, then we have forced mate in 21. If they go to c2, forced mate in 20. I don't know that I would be able to do it that quickly, but let's just say they went all the way over here because that's what the position is shown on many of the other sites, so that looks more familiar to me. Okay. Now, it says we wanted to play rook c1 as our best move. I don't know about that, because then doesn't the king approach the pawn? I don't know. If we play rook to c1 as the top engine suggestion is, that removes this where I thought we were supposed to be blocking the black king from getting closer, and it doesn't have the building the bridge property. Rook to f1, I understand, because the king probably doesn't want to come closer right now. So it would have to go further away, right? If we moved the rook and checked, it could come close to our pawn, but then we can safely get the king out of the way, can't we? No, because then they could check us. But it says they wouldn't go there. But what if they did? And then it says we would go, oh yeah, they couldn't safely check us because then we can promote. So if we moved here, it says they could check us. In fact, Stockfish is settling on that as the top move. But if they check us, wouldn't we just promote then? And that solved the whole problem already. Because now, like, they can take it, but if they don't take it, then we have a queen and a rook. And so, yeah, their best move is definitely to take it, but then we take their rook, and now we're in a king and rook endgame. And if you've seen any of my older videos, we know how to win a king and rook endgame. If you don't, check out some of my older videos where I show how to win this endgame. I learned this earlier this year or late last year. Okay, so let's back up to the beginning, and we'll go with their best move. Now, again, it says, okay, now we don't have a forced mating sequence according to Stockfish. It says plus 67. That's interesting, because if you back up, it says if they play rook to g2, we have a mate in 22. But once they actually play rook to g2, Stockfish is not showing a mating sequence. But we have a huge advantage. And again, it's showing rook to c1, which gets away from this. Okay, I think I understand the rook to c1 idea, maybe. because then we can get our king out this way, out from in front of our pawn, and we'll be 1 square from promotion, and they won't be able to check us on the c file because our rook is there. I don't know what we would do if they checked us down here on g8 at that point. But let's say if we did play rook to c1. It says they could check us, but it's plus 99 either way. Plus 99 is pretty high without actually getting to a mating sequence. They could play rook to a2, or king to e6, or rook to g8 check, and it's all about the same. But I think since we've moved our rook here, it's not preventing, you know what I mean? It's strongly discouraging their rook from coming over here to check us once we move our king. But right now it is their turn, so let's say that they checked us. Okay, now the Stockfish has jumped and found a mate in 19. And of course, we would move here because it's our only legal move. But I mean, now what do they do? Do they come for our pawn? I think they would, because then they would have two pieces guarding the promotion square. Okay, so they would go there. Now do we check? No, we come over here now. Or we could go ahead and promote and still have mate in 17? Wait a minute. Okay, let's say we promote and they take it, guarded by their king. Now we've lost our pawn. I thought that was our advantage. Okay, now here there is only one winning move, and that is to check them. Okay, and that forces them to get away from the rook. That makes sense, because our king has some control over these squares, and our rook, of course, is cutting off these squares. So their king has to move away from the rook. So whichever square it chooses, then we would win their rook. And now, again, we're in a rook and king versus king endgame, and we know how to win that. Okay, back to the beginning. Again, let's just say that they did this. Now, the concept of building a bridge or a barrier that was mentioned on these other web pages was kept talking about moving our rook to the 4th rank. Now, it says in a few positions you could go to the 5th rank, but then their king is really close to approaching. So I'm trying to understand what that was about, but they also talked about, okay, I remember what that was about. That was so that if we ever moved out and they checked us, we could get back in front of our pawn. Not there, but maybe here. And then if they checked us, and we could come back. And if they checked us, we could come back. And if they checked us, then we would step in front with our rook. And that's what the barrier was talking about. In protecting our king from their rook, which would be down here. And our king would be here. And our rook would be where this bluish-purple circle is. But then, wouldn't their king move to protect the pawn at that point? Okay, and that's why I think one of the other sites talked about checking them first, like here. And that kept them, it pushed them away. Now it says their top move is actually to go here, so I'm not sure exactly what's going on. Maybe that was in a slightly different position, because they could come here now. Okay, it doesn't. So we would want to line up with our pawn at this point, I guess, to keep them from coming here to d2 to hit our pawn. Okay, so now where are they going to go? It says rook to g3, rook to h2, or king to e5. Well, I don't know what they would do. We might end up having to play this against Stockfish and see what it does and then how we should respond. But in that case, we won't have these suggested moves up here on the right. So, but I'm going to try it, and we'll see if I've figured any of this out. Okay, I have set up, we're now playing against Stockfish, and Stockfish 8, sorry, this is, I think it's Stockfish level 8, which is the highest level on Lichess. So I don't know what version of Stockfish it is, but it's the highest level available that we can play against. And the computer chose to move its rook over here. Okay, so I do know that we can check. The reason it moved its rook over there is to keep our king from coming out this way. I know that we can check, but then we saw that the king moved toward our pawn. So I don't know if this is where we move forward to build the barrier or the bridge, or what exactly the idea is here. But I'm going to try checking and see if it moves toward our pawn. It did not move toward our pawn. Okay. I think here what we want to do now is move our rook toward... We don't want to get our king out just yet. I know that, because then they can just check us. But I think maybe let's play here and see if their king comes toward our rook. Okay, they've moved the rook to this side to keep our king from coming out here. So let's bring our king out this side and see, because their king can't get any closer because our rook is cutting off the f-file. So once we move here, they're going to have to check us. Okay. Now, again, the idea for our rook is that this is the barrier here, as some people call a bridge. And maybe they might just be referring to the fact the rook is here is a bridge. I don't know. But we are not going to move directly in front of our pawn. We're going to move this way, I think. Or should we go here and then there? I don't know. Let's try this. And see if they check us again. Then we're going to go here. And if they check us again, we're going to go to d5, where we can... Okay, they moved the king. Okay. Their king is coming for our rook. So I might have made a mistake in the way that I got out of check. I just don't know. But... Okay, but I do know that if they check us now... Actually, now if they come... Oh, they took the pawn. Okay, so I messed up. I messed up. All right. That's why I'm doing this session. And again, the only reason it's on video is because why not record my my learning troubles here, my learning process, and see if anyone can follow along. I'm going to go back to the board editor. I'm going to set up the board here, and I'm going to scroll down. You cannot see the drop-down menu for some reason. The Lucena position, we're going to continue from here, play with the computer. We're going to play with the white pieces. We should be able to force a win. Okay. Again, Stockfish has chosen to move the rook to c2. Maybe we need to go to d... I think if we go to d1, their king just comes toward our pawn, right? Or can we check them now? Because earlier when I moved here, their king went away, didn't it? One of those squares. And then I messed up after that. We could just check it here right now, but I don't know what that would accomplish. So let's do what we did before, because I think we were still doing okay then. Okay, and it did move away. And now we can't move our king out this way because they will check us. And then we would just have to get back in front of the pawn where we were. So I think I was right to play to f4 to prepare the barrier. Okay. Now should I get out this way? Let's get out of the way this way and see if that's any better. Okay, it did check me. And instead of getting back behind the pawn, we're going to come in front of the pawn. And then we're going to go here. Okay. Now this is, I think, where I messed up last time was moving the king away from the pawn. So let's not do that. Let's not move the king away from the pawn. The reason that I did it was to guard this square, but then I wasn't protecting the pawn anymore. Let's see. Can we just put the rook here with the king protecting both? No, because then their rook would take our pawn. We would have to take it, and their king would get our rook, and it would be a draw from insufficient material. Okay, so we don't want to put our rook there. We can check. We can check. Where are they going to go if we check? Okay, they went back. I'm not sure exactly why. Let's see. Oh, I guess to keep our rook from coming in over here. Can we go one forward? And that's headed this way. Now we've cut their rook off from our pawn. Okay, and they've taken it, so now we should be able to promote. And we know how to win with a queen and a king. Set the board. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Okay, I went past it. There it is. Lucena position. You see that here. Rook plus pawn versus rook to Lucena. Okay. Continue from here. Play with the computer. Play with the white pieces. Well, because we know that if the computer had the white pieces that we would lose, because this is a winning position for white, or for the side that has the pawn. So we did right to check. And we did right to go to the 4th rank. But then their king, okay, they did something slightly different this time. Now, I don't know how much difference that makes. So let's bring the king out from in front of the pawn. We expect them to check us. They did not check us. Okay, then here we just promote the pawn and take their rook. And now we are again in a completely winning, we know how to win the endgame with just the rook. Okay, now here on the chess.com page about the Lucena position, there are some traps and tricks down near the bottom of the page. Tricks and traps in the Lucena position. So it says if your opponent is familiar with the Lucena position, they'll do everything in their power to prevent you from performing the right attacking moves. Their best chance is to catch you off guard by playing other defensive lines. So if I just keep playing against Stockfish on Lichess, or probably even here on chess.com, we're going to keep seeing the same 2 or 3 variations is my guess, because in each case Stockfish knows what its best move is. So we might not see some of these variations that we would see from a human opponent. But it says one trick your opponent can throw at you is to attack your rook with their king. Imagine that you move your rook to the 4th rank, and instead of just stepping back, their king moves closer to your rook to prevent you from shielding your pawn. Okay, so that's obviously one idea. And it says, however, by moving their king to the 5th rank, your opponent has left the 8th rank unprotected and will not have time to move their king back to its defensive post. The easiest way to win is to move your rook to the 8th rank to protect the promotion square of your pawn. So it's showing here in this moving picture, if they attack your rook, you would just drop it back and try to get behind your pawn, apparently. I think here is where it shows that. Oh no, it's going back to the 8th rank to protect the promotion square. Okay, I was reading 1st rank. Okay, 8th rank. That makes sense. But we're not going to see that variation is what I was saying playing against Stockfish. So anyway, I'm going to keep practicing this. I'm going to practice it against Stockfish on both sides. I'm going to play with it myself in the analysis board. And then once I feel like I have it, I'm probably going to make what I call my teaching videos, which is where I explain what I've learned and in a teaching format, which helps me to glue it into my brain. So hopefully that will happen soon. And hopefully you guys got something out of this as well. I hate to put content up that nobody gets anything out of but me. But keep in mind, the whole reason for this channel is to record my education and my process of learning and improving at chess. But anyway, I do thank you all for watching and for interacting. We'll see you next time.